this video series, I'm going to have a chat with Shamubeel Eaqub, a known economist, and Janine Starks, a known financial commentator, specifically focusing in on this issue of exit repayment in the retirement villages framework, and what's really fair for consumers, and what are some of the unfair aspects about the existing modelling used by operators. So this resident-funded model, Shamubeel, appears to be socially licensed. Do you have some thoughts about how this has happened over the years and been allowed to continue to happen?
Yeah, I think it's really a kind of an accident of history. When the retirement village industry really kind of took off in New Zealand, there was not much regulation and the sector was tiny. And as it grew, it didn't have access to normal forms of capital. It had a relatively easy run of it with a few residents really wanting this high quality product. And that became the norm. And unfortunately what happens is norms are not always the best ways of doing things. Right. It was the way it was done back then because there was so much demand and there were not alternatives. But now the sector is getting bigger. Even now we're seeing this extraordinary amount of demand from people retiring, wanting this good quality product. But the model hasn't changed. And if you look at us compared to other countries around the world with similar kind of industries, what you find is we are much, much less fair in the way that we treat residents' capital, the way that we share capital gains, and there is nothing right about the way we do it. It just happens to be the way that the industry has grown, and it has almost happened in a vacuum of regulation. And a big part of that is that it's an industry that's not regulated strongly. And regulators are always catching up. That's the reality of regulation. Regulators will always catch up to the reality of today. Yes. But I think the time has come for that in the retirement village sector in New Zealand. The sector is big. There are a lot of people who are using the services. They enjoy the services. But there is a duty of care by our regulators to ensure that the rules and regulations and the practices of the industries are fair and that they're equitable to everybody.
So let me just tease that out a little bit more of this sense of duty of care and fairness. The framework as it stands seems to create a pricing structure which, for example, enables operators to repay money to consumers when a suitable replacement resident comes in. Isn't there something in that pricing mechanism which is about power imbalance?
Massively so. Yeah. Can you imagine any other transaction where somebody says, well, it's a shame that you want to sell it, I'll just find another buyer, and then we'll sort it out when I find a buyer that I like. There are no requirements on you. But when I buy a house and sell a house, there are some pretty strict norms. So within 28 days, you're going to make sure that this is paid unless these exceptions happen. But that's not what's happening in this sector. So why is it that when you sell a retirement village unit, all of a sudden, none of the normal rules of commerce apply? We must have this entirely new set of rules that are all in favor of the provider. So our older population is growing, and it's growing rapidly, but the nature of that older population is becoming more unequal. So we're seeing more and more older people who are retiring with very little wealth, quite often without a home or a home with a mortgage. And the way that we kind of conceptualize it is the home ownership rate of a typical retiree in the 1980s and 90s used to be about 84%. You fast forward 10 years, it's probably going to be 2/3. You fast forward another 10 years, it might be closer to 50%. So we are looking at a model that relies on people retiring in wealth to be able to access these retirement village options. But we're actually going to need a lot more variety of older people's accommodation in the future. And that is not going to happen if we get stuck in the current model, which is reliant on essentially using the residents' capital to be able to build these villages. We are going to need variety, and that is not going to happen on its own. No market will shift when the profits are there. You need an intervention of some sort, and the best kind of intervention we can make is regulatory in this instance, because there is a fundamental issue of equity and fairness. The current model is not fair and is not efficient and is not going to deliver the right outcomes for future residents. Why would we not plan for it now and move towards that over time?
Because I have seen a lot of commentary from some segments that say a mandated early repayment is unaffordable.
But let's put it this way. What they're saying is that it's okay for the residents to pay for it, but it's not okay for them to pay for it.
Right.
Because essentially, if they're not paying for the early repayment, it means it's the person who sold the property back to the village, they're the one who are paying the cost. At the moment, it's invisible, right? It's hidden with the individuals. So what they're saying, it's fair that the resident who sold the property and has moved on, it's fair for them and their family to pay for this. But they could not possibly, these retirement villages that make so much money, it couldn't possibly be fair on them.
Yes, and they're taking all the capital gains. They have the ownership rights. So here is somebody that doesn't own the unit at all, having to behave like they do and missing out. We call it a use of money, don't we? Right. A loss on the use of money. So if it takes 6 months to sell your unit, you haven't been able to put that money into KiwiSaver or pay off your own mortgage if it was an inheritance that your parents passed away or decided to sell the unit. You're missing out on returns. And yet you're having to do that when you don't own the unit. The operator does. And they're now complaining that they can't afford it. Yet they can afford all the other business costs that go up and down. Because in a normal contract, in economic norms, you would give the operator an interest-free loan in return for living in the unit, the right to occupy. You've got this home to live in, fair enough, but you would get the capital gains. So when they take both, when they take the capital gains and they're getting the benefit of an interest-free loan, it's double dipping. So when I put the numbers together, I'm saying this is the reality. Because they're double dipping, these are the benefits to them. They're getting your gains, they're getting your deferred management fee, they're making a development margin when you first move in, and they've got the benefit of your capital for free. And of course they'd like me to take that number out, but I'm insisting on keeping it there to show the reality of what double dipping is in an unfair model.
But there is an opportunity cost to the person who is living in the unit. They have given you this capital and they're not going to get any return on that capital, right? There is no capital gains on that. And you're going to pay your fee out of it. And you're not going to get a return on the capital that's being held.
That's
but
right.
It's not like the business is not going to use that money. If the shareholders really say that we are willing to have a return that's less than the OCR, I'd be very surprised.
Yeah, they wouldn't.
But essentially the investors are saying, it's okay for us to have a high return.
Yes.
But we will give no return. We will recognize no return for the residents. That's the power asymmetry that we keep coming back to. That's at the core of all of this.
Yes.
Like, we would never operate a business. We don't earn a very high rate of return.
Nobody would.
Right? No. Nobody would. But they're saying, but for residents, the rules are different.
Do you want to talk a bit more about that, the cost of that exit repayment?
Yes, I spent some time calculating it because I wanted to add perspective on this, because the operators were catastrophizing it and saying that if they had to make this exit repayment and give you the money back for your license fee, their businesses would somehow fail, that they wouldn't be able to build more units. It was going to be absolutely awful. The world was caving in. And I thought, hang on, right, let's price this up and see what it really comes to. And the answer for a 28-day buyback, which the operators consider ridiculously short, is $13,000 per unit. So when you look at that, the perspective I wanted to put on it was that when your unit sells to the next person, they're able to crystallize some capital gains. And if we just ignore all the other elements of revenue that they've earned out of you, if we just look at the capital gains, on that $600,000 unit, the modelling that we had, that MHUD had given the parameters for, the Ministry of Housing, then they were going to make another $500,000 in capital gains. If you had to pay $13,000 and say interest costs, because you might have to get a line of credit, it's like a small credit card, this isn't a big long mortgage that these operators are taking out, that small credit card debt costs you 13 grand, and you're about to earn yourself $500,000 for your shareholders. look at those two numbers, when you look at them as a percentage, it's only 3% of the capital gains. Not even that, it's actually about 2.6.
Yes.
So it's when we have these exit repayments, it's the equivalent of the operator still getting more than 97% of the capital gains, and only losing, it's only about 2.6% there. So perspective, everybody, is that much. We've got operators out there that are starting to share the gains 50-50. Not many of them. There's only a very small handful around the country. And what we're trying to do here is pull back some fairness for those who are getting nothing. There are families out there that earn no capital gains, and it would be that very small amount of money. And I think that puts incredible perspective on it for everybody, and the policymakers